We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Dalet Amud Beis in Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 94b. The Mishnah continues, Avol bat shoal es hapara ve'achar kach shoal es habaylim. If the person first borrows the cow and only after that he borrows the services of its owner, o sachan, or he hires the owner after again he borrows the cow. So there, since the borrowing of the owner or the hiring of the owner was after the borrowing of the cow, v'meisa chayev. There, if the cow dies, he's chayev shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, ba'olav ein imo shalem yishalem. If the owner is not with him, then he surely has to pay. And Rashi explains, Avol shoal es hapara, if he borrows the cow, Ashma'in, and the Mishnah is teaching us, Afal pi shehoya imo b'shas onse, even though the owner was working with him at the time of the accident, lo have she'ela b'baylim, that's not considered she'ela b'baylim, it's not considered borrowing the animal together with the owner, lifture, in order to exempt him, ela imkein hoya imo b'shas she'ela, the owner has to be with him at the time of the borrowing. V'tayim ha'mefarsh b'Gemara, the reason will be explained in the Gemara. And the Gemara says, Midiktani Seifa, from the fact that it says at the end of the Mishnah, Ve'achar kach shoal es hapara, that afterwards he borrowed the cow, Mechlal de Reisha de Katani ima mamish. It sounds like in the Reisha, when it talks about borrowing the owner together with the cow, it really means together with the cow. But the Gemara says, Ima mamish mi mashkachasla, is it possible to actually have it happen all at the exact same time? Meaning you borrow the cow and the services of the owner at the same time? Is that even possible? Para b'meshicha uvaylim ba'amira, because the cow is only borrowed when you do a physical kinyan, when you pull the cow, but the owner is borrowed for his services with amira, with a statement alone, and so therefore it can happen at the exact same time. And Rashi says, "Ubailam ba'amira," the owner's services are borrowed ba'amira with a statement. Misha amar lo hare parasi va'ani nishalin lach. When the owner says that my cow and my services are going to be lent to you, have a gufo sholo, so his body from that moment already, he's already giving his services over. Upara kati mechzer mashicha, but the para, by the cow, you still need a mashicha, you still need that physical kinyan pulling the cow. V'alkein havale shoal bailam v'achar kach shoal para. So isn't that a case where he's actually first borrowing the owner's services, and only after that he's borrowing the cow? It's not happening at the exact same time. And the Gemara says, if you want, I could say the following answer. Could go into Kaimah para bechatzero de shoal. The case is the cow already is standing in the courtyard of the borrower to lo mechzer mashicha. So now you don't need to do a mashicha, you don't need to do a physical kinyan. So it's all happening with the amira, with the statement at the exact same time. If you want, I could say another answer. Do amar lei, he says to him like this: At gufech lo tishal, you yourself, I'm not going to be borrowing your services, so to speak. At shas mashichas parascha, until the time of the pulling of your cow. So you set it up in that fashion that it all happens at the same time. And the Gemara continues, Tanan Hasam, we learned in the Mishnah over there, this is the Mishnah earlier, Arba Shomrim, there are four kinds of Shomrim, four kinds of watchmen, Shomer Chinam, V'ashol no Sesachar V'hasocher. There's the one who watches and he's not paid, the borrower, the paid watchman, and also the renter. Shomer Chinam Nishba Al HaKol, the Shomer Chinam swears on everything, V'ashol Meshalem Es HaKol, the borrower pays for everything, no Sesachar V'hasocher. When it comes to the Shomer Sachar and Socher, Nishboin Al HaShvura V'al HaShvuyi V'al HaMesa, they take an oath, let's say it breaks a leg, or let's say it gets captured or dies, and they pay for Aved and Geneva, they pay if it's lost or if it's stolen. And Rashi explains, Nishboy, and again it said that the Shomer Sachar and Socher, they take a shvua, let's say it breaks a leg or gets captured or dies, Shekain hu, they have to take a shvua, that's actually what happened. Shalo Pashuba, that there was no negligence, Shalo Shalchu Bayad, they didn't misappropriate it, that's the shvua that they take. And the Gemara continues, Menahani Mili, from where do we know all of this in terms of the Arba Shomrim, the Tanu Rabbanon, because the rabbis taught, Parsha Rishona, the first Parsha in the Torah that talks about Shomrim, Namra B'Shomer Chinam, that Parsha is referring to a Shomer Chinam. Shnia B'Shomer Sachar, the second one's talking about a Shomer Sachar, a paid watchman, and Shlishas B'Shoel, the third one is talking about a Shoel, a borrower. And the Gemara says, B'Shlama Shlishas B'Shoel Mefurish. I understand the third one's talking about a borrower, that's clear in the Psukim. V'chi Yishal Ishmei Imre'eu V'nishbar Omeis Ba'ola Ve'inimo Shalem Yishalem. It talks about a person borrowing from another person, and the animal breaks its leg or dies, and the owner is not with him. As we said, the owner is not with him. His services are not being hired out to the borrower, or he's not providing services to the borrower at that time. So Shalem Yishalem, so he surely has to pay. But you're suggesting that the first parsha is Shomer Chinam and the second parsha is Shomer Sachar. Maybe I can reverse it. Who says that's what it's talking about? And the Gemara says to that, Mistabra makes sense to say, Shniya b'shomer sachar, makes sense to say the second parsha is talking about a paid watchman, Shekain Chayib b'gneva v'aveda, because if he's getting paid, he should have a higher level of responsibility. It talks about the fact that he's obligated if it gets stolen or lost, and therefore it makes sense that that higher level of responsibility for gneva v'aveda, that belongs to the shomer sachar. But the Gemara continues, Adrab, on the contrary, Shona b'shomer sachar. Why don't we say that the first parsha shomer sachar, Shekain mishalim tashlume kefil b'toin tainas ganav, because the first parsha talks about paying the double payment by toin tainas ganav, meaning to say the way we understand the first parsha, it's talking about a shomer chinam. A shomer chinam is exempt. Let's say there's a gneva, he's exempt if it's stolen from him. But let's say he claims it was stolen from him, and it turns out that he's the ganav, so that's called toin tainas ganav. He's claiming gneva, but it wasn't really stolen, so you have to pay kefil. So that's a certain stringency that appears by shomer chinam, who's exempt in general from gneva v'aveda. But if that's a certain stringency, maybe that's really talking about a shomer sachar. Maybe the shomer sachar really is the one that's exempt from gneva v'aveda, even though he's getting paid, but he has that certain stringency of toin tainas ganav that he has to pay kefil. How do you know that the first parsha is talking about a shomer chinam? And the Gemara says, no, afilu hachi, nevertheless, karna below shavua, if you pay the karen, if you pay the principal without an oath, meaning the fact that you're responsible for gneva, that's adifa, that is considered a higher level of responsibility, mikafela b'shavua, from having to pay double when you took an oath to get out of it, meaning like we say by a shomer chinam, by toin tainas ganav, that's still a lesser level of responsibility. And the Gemara says, Teda, you should know that that is the case, that paying the karen without an oath is a higher level of responsibility, to hashoel kol hanashalo, because a shoel, a borrower, he gets all the benefit he wants from what he is borrowing, ve'ena mashalem ela karen, and he only pays the principal in exactly that kind of a case. Let's say a shoel is responsible for accidents, for if it's stolen or lost, what does he pay in that case? He pays the principal, he doesn't pay double, but that's considered a higher level of responsibility because he's responsible to pay immediately if those things happen to the item. And Rashi explains, Parsha Rishona, the first Parsha, Gimel Parshios Hein Smuchos, there are three Parshios that deal with Shomrim that are next to one another. If a person gives his friend money or vessels to watch, Uva Patra ala Geneva. In that parsha, it talks about an exemption. Let's say the item is stolen. D'chsiv, as it's written, V'gunav mi beisa ish. It says it's stolen means to say shetoen shenignav heimenu, that the shomer claims that it was stolen. D'chsiv v'nikra balabayis elho Elohim v'ukimna l'shvua. The pasuk talks about the balabayis coming to take an oath. Shenishba shelo shalach bayad. He takes an oath that he didn't misappropriate the item, and that again we say is talking about a shomer chinam, where you have this concept of toen tainas ganav. V'achareh ki yitin ishal reo chamoro. Then you have the parsha where a person is given a donkey or an ox or a sheep, and there we say the person is chayiv if it's stolen, upater ala onsen, but he is pater if there's an accident. B'shvua, he takes an oath about that. T'chsiv, as it's written, umeso nishbar o nishba shvuas Hashem tiyeh. It says if it dies or breaks a leg or it gets captured, then there's a shvua, there's an oath. V'im gonov yugonav yishalim, but if it's stolen, then he has to pay. Ushlishis, and then the third parsha v'chiyishal, that talks about borrowing, v'chayiv ba esa onsen, and there you're chayiv for accidents kishein ba'ol of imo, if the owner is not with him in terms of providing services, upater b'bailim, but if the owner is providing services, so then there's an exemption. And then the Gemara mentioned betoin tainas ganav, again by shomer chinam, if he claims ganav but he really is the ganav, he has to pay kefil. Toin shenignav ha'imenu, he's claiming it was stolen from him. V'nimsa shuatzmo ganva, turns out that he's really the ganav. Chayiv ba kefil, then he has to pay double. The parsha rishona, that's what it says in the first parsha. D'chsiv, as it's written, im lo yimotzei haganav v'samech le'al kol dvar pesha yishalem shnayim. It talks about not finding the ganav, and then it says paying double. V'kimna b'perak meruba, we talk about this in Bava Kammah in perak meruba. Im lo yimotzei kemo she'omer lahu atzmo ganva. We understand the pasuk to mean we don't find the ganav because he's the ganav. Then yishalem shnayim, then he has to pay double. Okagon shenish batchila l'sheka shenignava. The case specifically is, let's say he took an oath at the outset and he took a false oath that it was stolen. Avol bo edim kodem shenish batchila l'sheka. Now let's say witnesses come and say that he's the ganav, but he never took a false oath. Eino mishalem kefil. In that case, he actually doesn't have to pay double. Because it says, Im lo yimatzei haganav u'chvar nishba v'nikra balabayis elho Elohim l'shvua al kol devar pesha asher yarshion dayonim be'edim yishalem shnayim. Again, the idea that you have to take the false oath. And so now Rashi explains the question of the Gemara. V'kevan de chumra, since toin tainas ganav is a chumra of paying kefil, shad yelahach parsha sa shomer sachar. Sacher. Why not say this parsha Shomer Sacher? Te'ilu parsha Shniel like a kefil, because in the second parsha there is no paying double because you have to pay if it's stolen. That's not a claim of exemption. Once he says it was stolen in the second parsha, he has to pay the principal. And then the Gemara said, nevertheless, the second parsha still is considered more strict than the first. Because if you have to pay the principal without an oath, which is in the second parsha, right when you say it's stolen, you have to pay the keren. Even if there was no false oath, this is more strict than the first parsha, because there's an exemption from paying the principal if there's no witnesses that come that he was the thief. Now, even though he pays double after the false oath, and the witnesses come and say he's the thief, without shvua there's no kefil. So the idea again is that the paying the keren right away, that's considered more strict. And the Gemara said, you should know that's true. You should know that that's considered more strict. Because Shoel, who has the highest level of responsibility, clearly, we don't say that he pays kefil and he's exempt if he claims it was stolen, but he pays kefil if it turns out that he's the ganav. We don't say that. We say that he just pays the principal immediately if he claims it was stolen. Because a borrower, he gets all the benefit from the item. For free, he's able to use whatever item or whatever animal for his work. So certainly you should be more strict by a Shoel. And yet, what does that higher level of responsibility entail? It entails that you pay the principal without an oath. We don't say that a Shoel can be exempt with an oath in order that he should be brought to the level of kefil should it turn out that he's the ganav. That we don't say. So you see clearly that keren below shvua is considered to be stricter. But the Gemara continues, V'hashoel kol hanoah shelo. Is it really true that a borrower gets all the benefit from the item? But doesn't he need to feed the animal? So that's not all the benefit. He has a responsibility to feed the animal he's borrowing. The Gemara says, Dekaima ba'agam. No, the case is that the animal just stands in the swamp. It means to say it's a place where there's food that's freely available. So you could have a situation where he doesn't need to feed the animal. But the Gemara says, V'abai natira, but he needs to watch over the animal. So the Gemara says to that, Benatar masa. We're talking about a person who's a guard in the city anyway, so he's not doing any additional guarding, so kol hanoah shelo, he's getting all the benefit. If you want, I could say lo tema kol hanoah shelo. We don't mean all the benefit is the shoel's. Ela ema rov hanoah shelo. We just mean the majority of the benefit goes to him. He gets a lot of benefit, even if it's not entirely benefit. And if you want, I could say b'shelas kelim. We're talking about borrowing vessels where you don't really have to do work of feeding or watching over it much, and therefore, again, there we can apply kol hanoah shelo. He gets all of the benefit. And the Gemara continues, no say sacher v'asocher nishboin ala shvura v'ala shvuya v'ala mesa. We said above that a shomer sacher and a renter, they take an oath on if it breaks a leg, it gets injured, or if, let's say, it gets captured or dies. U'mishalmen es ha'aveda v'saganeva, but they have to pay if it's lost or stolen. B'shlama ganeva, so the Gemara says, I understand they pay if it's stolen. T'chsiv, it's written in the pasuk, im ganov yiganev me'imo yishalim lebolav. It says if it's stolen, they have to pay. Ela aveda menolan, where do we know they have to pay if it's lost? And the Gemara says, the Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, im ganov yiganev, it says this double language. Ainli ela ganeva, I only know if it's stolen. Aveda minayin, how do we know that if it's lost, you have to pay? Talmud lomer im ganov yiganev mikol makom. He uses that double language. That tells us even if something happens that's not exactly a ganeva, even if it gets lost, the shomer sacher is responsible. The Gemara says, hanichal da amar lo amrin and dibur Torah kolashim b'nei adam. Now that works according to the one who says that we don't say the Torah speaks the way that people speak. So then we really have an extra word over here. We could darshan the extra word. But according to the one who says that the Torah speaks in the way that people commonly speak, so ganov yiganev is just the way that people speak. That's not considered extra. You can't make a drasha. So ma'ikal amemer. So what are you going to say? How do we learn out Aveda according to that man amar? And the Gemara says, Amri b'ma'arava, they say in the West, kal v'chomer. It's the following kal v'chomer. It's logical. Uma ganeva shekrova la'onas mishalim. If ganeva, which is close to an accident, the shomer sacher has to pay for, Aveda shekrova l'pshia, if it's lost, which is closer to negligence, so lo kal shekain, most certainly he would have to pay for that. V'idach, now the other one who doesn't learn it out from a kal v'chomer, so we do have a kal v'chomer. What do we need a pasuk for? Sometimes milsa da'asi b'kal v'chomer tarach v'kasav lakra. Sometimes something which you could learn from a kal v'chomer, the pasuk takes the effort and actually writes it into the pasuk. And then the Gemara continues, Vashol Mashalim Esakol. We said above that a borrower pays for everything. Bishlama Shvuro Meis, I understand if it gets injured or if it dies, Dechsiv, it's written in the pasuk. V'chiyishal Ishmei Imreu v'nishbar Omeis. It says in the pasuk, either it breaks its leg, it gets injured, or it dies. Ela Shvuya B'Shol Menolim. Where do we know know that a borrower is responsible for shvuya if it gets captured. Now maybe you'll say we can learn it out from injury and death. That's a similar kind of thing, but it's not similar. Because if it gets injured or dies, that is an accident, but it's an accident that would occur to the person. He would think that might happen. Tomer b'shvuya, whereas we say by captured, that's an onus, it's an accident that doesn't occur to anyone. It never occurs that it's going to be captured, so maybe he's not responsible for that. And so the Gemara instead says, rather the source is as follows. It mentions shvura umesa by a borrower, and it mentions shvura umesa by a shomer sachar as well, in terms of the shomer sachar being exempt. Just like over there by shomer sachar, it also mentions captured, that the shomer sachar is exempt. Afkan, so too over here where the shol is responsible, shavuya imo, we say that shvuya also counts among the things that the shoel is responsible for. And what the Gemara is referring to is the same pasuk that Rashi quoted above by shomer sachar. It says by shomer sachar umeis o nishbar o nishba. It says it dies or it gets injured or it gets captured. So then shvuas Hashem tiyah, you take an oath, you say that the shomer sachar is exempt. That's what we're referring to when we say that captured is mentioned together with the other cases when it comes to shomer sachar. And so that's why the Gemara is saying by shoel as well, captivity also should be included in the things that a shoel is responsible for. But the Gemara says but you can refute that because by shomer sachar we're including captivity as something that's an exemption. Tomer b'shoel shekain l'chiyav, whereas when it comes to a borrower, he's actually going to be obligated in the case of shvuya, in the case of captivity. So who says we go that far that a borrower is even going to be obligated by a case of where the animal is captured? And so the Gemara says Elek Rabbi Nosson. Rather, the source really is like Rabbi Nosson says. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Nosson says O l'rabos shavuya. It says the word O. It talks about the fact that it's injured or it dies, and that word O, which means or, that comes to include captivity as well, that the shoel is responsible for. But the Gemara says, one second, Hay O mi boile l'chalik, that word O, that's needed to make a distinction, to make a separation. Because maybe I would have thought that the animal has to get injured and die in order to be chayiv. You need to have both of them. That's why Kammah malon. That's why it says O, either one. If it gets injured or it dies, the shoel is responsible. So how can you use the word O to include shavuya? And the Gemara says, Hanichel Rabbi Yonasan. Now it makes sense according to Rabbi Yonasan. We can understand why we can use the O for the inclusion, as we'll see in a moment. But according to Rabbi Yoshia, you really do need the O in order to make that separation. So what are you going to say according to Rabbi Yoshia? And where do we see that Rabbi Yoshia, as opposed to Rabbi Yonasan, requires the O for separation? The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, Isha shel yakalel es aviv v'yasimo, it says that a man curses his father and his mother. Ainli elo aviv v'imo. I only know that he curses, that the pasuk is talking about cursing both of the mother and the father. Aviv below imo, imo below aviv minayin. How do we know if he just curses the father without the mother, or the mother without the father? How do we know that he's responsible for that as well? Tamilomer, the pasuk says aviv v'imo kilel. It says his father, his mother he curses. It means to say aviv kilel, imo kilel. It means to say that his father he curses, his mother he curses. Divrei Rabbi Yoshia, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yonasan says mashma shneim ke'echad. No, it's mashma both at once. Umashma echad b'fnei atzma, but it's also mashma, even just the simple understanding of the pasuk is mashma each one on its own. And Rashi explains, Hanicha, it works out, Hadalomi boilach o lechalik. The fact that we don't need the word O to make that separation, that works Rabbi Yonasan. That works according to Rabbi Yonasan, to lo boil lechalik. He doesn't need an O to create that separation. V'omar de nishbar v'meis have a mashma o hai. He says that just naturally, when the pasuk says nishbar v'meis, it means to say either it gets injured or it dies. Hai motzi l'midrashay l'rabo shvuya. So then you have the extra O to include shvuya, because that's really what Rabbi Yonasan is saying when it comes to his father and mother that he curses as well, that naturally we understand the separation. And Rashi continues, Aviv kilel imo kilel, that was within Rabbi Yoshia, since it says Aviv imo kilel, we understand it's his father or his mother. The idea is betchilaso samach klala la'aviv. Originally, the word klala is by father. Besofo samach klala l'imo. Then at the end of the pasuk, it puts the word klala next to mother. That's how you understand it's either or according to Rabbi Yoshia, whereas Rabbi Yonasan says naturally we understand that it's either or, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Hey Amud Aleph.